talking with Darrell Bock about Jesus and the New Testament. Darrell, some problems remain, don't they? I mean, you've written at length about the great differences in the genealogies between Matthew and Luke, or the fact that Luke seems to place Governor Quirinius around 4 BC instead of much later when we're pretty sure he was the governor. These are real problems.
They are real problems, and we are often dealing with ancient evidence that we don't have everything. Everyone who works in ancient history understands that we only have a select amount of material from that period, so we don't know everything that we could know if we had a larger cache of documents. Nonetheless, history is about doing work with the materials that you have, in some cases making judgments about the materials that you have. And you oftentimes can explain these differences in ways that make sense culturally and historically, and that's what you try and do. So, for example, with the Quirinian census, there are two explanations that are often given. One is that the grammar of the Greek is such that we're talking about a census taken before the time of Quirinius. I actually don't think that works, but it is a very popular explanation. My own preference is to suggest that this process of census taking in the ancient world did take some time, and the census became attached to Quirinius because he wrapped it up administratively, but he wasn't responsible for the start of it, and allowing the period of time for that census to be collected, the data to be gathered together, and then finally finalized took some time.
Some would say that's just Christian apologetics, that's not real scholarship. You know, this is a mistake Luke made, live with it.
If someone says that, I can actually live with that solution in terms of being what someone's option and decision might be. But my own preference is to see, no, this is the ancient world. You know, we aren't in a digitized world. Things aren't so instantaneous. Processes do take time. Communication takes years to go from place one to place two because it goes by horse or by boat. It doesn't go by electronic wire. And so, like I said, these have a cultural context in which they operate that doesn't seem so natural to us, but that's because our culture is so different.
Your doctoral work was on the use of the Old Testament in Luke's Gospel in particular. Some people would be aware of the argument that many of the Jesus stories, like the virgin birth or even the way the crucifixion is described, were invented. They are creations of the Gospel writers who are trying to make Jesus look like he fulfills Old Testament prophecies. Now, you've thought about this a long time. Does that line of interpretation hold much weight?
I don't think so at all. Let's take the crucifixion as an example. The crucifixion is actually acknowledged by Jewish materials, by writers on the other side of the argument, if you will, that Jesus was crucified. We see this in the Talmudic materials. Which, by the way, also suggests that Jesus existed. And these materials acknowledge that Jesus died a death at the hands of the Romans. Josephus says the same thing, and although there are disputes about certain parts of the Josephus citation, most ancient historians recognize that Josephus did say something about the crucifixion of Jesus. So that event is not made up. And of course, what gets described with it is described in such detail in terms of the kinds of things that happen in association with crucifixion that fit the time that these descriptions match up. But more importantly, let's take the resurrection, which is certainly a crucial event for Christianity. If you were inventing this, if you were simply doing it for public relations spin, you're trying to sell a difficult idea. The Greeks didn't believe in resurrection. They believed at most in the immortality of the soul. And you're selling this idea, and you go to tell a story about how resurrection took place, and you start off with women being the first witnesses. Well, the problem is culturally that both for Greco-Romans and for Jews, women didn't have credibility as witnesses. So you're trying to spin a difficult idea. You have the right to invent the story and make up the details however you want, and you start off selling a difficult idea by using witnesses who don't count as witnesses culturally. That doesn't make sense. No one would make up the story that way. The women are there in the story because they were there in the story, and they were not pulled out because they belonged there. And this is the way the Gospels tell the story. And even though it's culturally embarrassing to have women be the first witnesses, and in fact the reaction, another important detail that I like to note about the resurrection is when the women tell the story, the reaction to them isn't, oh yeah, Jesus told us about this along the way, we believe it. No, they're going, no ladies, you've had a rough day, it's a little hard, we think you're being a little hysterical here to believe in the resurrection. So everything about the story has this edge to it that tells you that it's that it's not made up, that it's not the kinds of details someone would make up, because you don't make your leaders look bad when the women show up to tell you that a resurrection has taken place that Jesus predicted, and have them go, oh, they're hysterical, we really don't believe that.
But the virgin birth, many say that that was just invented because there's this Old Testament passage in Isaiah that talks about a young woman having a baby in unusual circumstances.
Well, one of the difficulties here, of course, is that the Isaiah passage wasn't seen as a virgin birth passage by Jews when we get to the New Testament. So you're making up a story that doesn't have a history of interpretation behind it. It's virgin birth ex nihilo. I actually think what's going on here is that you're getting a very Jewish reading of the text in patterns. Jews believe that God worked in the same kind of way over time. So something that he did in the short term is like something he will do eventually, although sometimes he might do it eventually in a greater kind of way. And that's what you've got going on with the virgin birth. You have a prediction of a child in the time of Ahaz who is born, who by the time that child reaches a certain age, certain things will have happened, showing that God is with us. And then when we come to the New Testament, it's the Ahaz story plus. Because now we have a virgin giving birth, not someone who just is inexperienced, but a virgin giving birth. That's the plus. And this child is God with us. That's not invention, that's pattern reading, and that's something that Jews often did with the Old Testament.
Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.